Welcome to Policy Brief, an informed and engaging conversation with policymakers, policy influencers, and public sector professionals. My name is Trevor Brown. I'm Dean of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. I'm joined by Mike McCurry. His simple title is Press Secretary, although he's done that in lots of different capacities, perhaps most famously for President of the United States, Bill Clinton. But for us, close to home, he served as press secretary for then presidential candidate, Senator John Glenn. He currently serves as the director of the Center on Public Theology at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. And looking forward to talking a little bit about that role, but starting with your role as press secretary. Mike, it's a pleasure to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you, Trevor.
Let's start, we like to start sort of civics 101 here. What's the job of the press secretary? What do you do?
Well, the job of the press secretary is to speak on behalf of the principal, in my case, the President of the United States, when the president is not otherwise available to the media. Now, there's a lot more that goes into the role, but it basically is the function of a spokesperson, someone who represents the elected official, someone who takes questions from the media, provides information, makes announcements, makes pronouncements, and basically tries to serve as that intermediary between the people that we elect and the media that holds them accountable. And it is a very interesting juxtaposition of roles in some ways. So
in a minute, I want to get into that juxtaposition of roles, but start by, you've done this for a lot of you use the term principles. So I'm probably not going to get the complete list, but you've done it for senator, you've done it for a presidential candidate, you've done it for a president, you've done it for the Democratic Party. Are there important differences, or is it sort of the same role across all those different principles?
It really is. In the situation, it can be very, very different. My first presidential campaign, of course, was with Senator Glenn in 1984, which really, made me into a lifetime presidential campaign press secretary, because I thoroughly enjoyed that and enjoyed traveling with John and Annie. It was just a wonderful experience, and he was such an interesting guy. We didn't do all that well in that campaign, but from that, I gained a lot of appreciation for his integrity, and I learned a lot of the skills that go into speaking on behalf of someone who's running for president. That served me well. Prior to that, I had been a press secretary in the United States Senate for Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Harrison Williams from New Jersey. And the roles are very different. In a presidential campaign, you have an eager flock of media that are anxious to get all the latest information. If you're a press secretary in the United States Senate, you're competing with 100 other press secretaries to try to get someone to notice what your boss is doing. So it's a different environment because the task is different. You're trying to make things interesting that the media might not otherwise find interesting, whereas working for the president or working in a campaign, you really have got a wrapped group of reporters who are there hanging on every word. So that's a different environment. I also had the experience of serving as spokesman for the National Democratic Party. That's an institutional role. You're actually advocating on behalf of a political party as opposed to an individual, although the chairman of the party is someone that you represent. I worked in a trade association. I've worked at the State Department, U.S. State Department as a spokesman. And that's a much different role because you're actually there representing the government of the United States as we speak abroad to other countries in a thing that we call public diplomacy. And then, of course, I worked at the White House for the president. So they're all kind of different. They have in common that you are there to try to explain to the media what the president is doing and explain to the president why the media is giving him such a rough time, which sometimes is not a very comfortable role, but it's a very necessary one, I think, very important in our public policy and the way in which we function as a self-governing democracy.
So you earlier say there's this juxtaposition of roles, and you just mentioned the sort of core role of, on the one hand, being a communicator, and on the other hand, being an advisor. So I want to unpack that a little bit and hear a little bit more, and maybe put you on the spot about Senator Glenn, who for us we hold near and dear as on the one hand, a wonderfully warm communicator. In a small room, when you were with him, you always felt connected to him. But he was an engineer at heart and wasn't always the most deft communicator. What was it like working with him on the campaign trail and trying to give voice to his good values and his ideas?
Well, you're correct. He was just such a wonderfully engaging person. And of course, there's nobody who's a bigger star than Annie. She was really just a delight to be with. And he communicated so effectively in those small group settings. But you're right, when he got off into the stage, it wasn't natural for him. And I've thought a lot about that. He was not a natural born politician. He was a military officer. And in the McCurry program, he had a whole team of people that were around him to encourage and guarantee the success of the mission. Political campaigns are very different. There are a lot of people who've got their own motives and their own agendas. And I don't think the senator fully understood that, because sometimes he would, we had lots of internal strife in the campaign. It was not, frankly, the most smoothly running presidential campaign that I've ever been associated with. But and we paid some price for that, but he came out of that experience, I think, with a reputation intact as someone who truly was an American hero. And it's not hard to be a spokesman for someone who is so greatly admired.
So let's talk about another person you had to serve as a communicator for. Now I want to ask about the advisor role. So you served President Bill Clinton, who was a remarkable communicator, somebody who just had that ability both in a small room and in a large room to connect. And I've got to believe there were times where he had ideas about things he wanted to say, and you thought maybe that's not such a good idea. How would you engage someone who, as president in particular, but these are powerful people who are really comfortable communicating? How would you say, hey, maybe this isn't the day we make that point?
Well, you have to approach the role with a great deal of humility, because I used to remind myself all the time, nobody elected me to be anything. They elected Bill Clinton to be president. And my job was to reflect and represent his thinking and his ideas and how he would voice himself, whatever he wanted to say to the public. And so you have to almost suppress your own feelings. In fact, even to the point of being an advisor, I refrain from giving a lot of advice, particularly in settings in which other cabinet people or senior White House staff were there, for this reason. I felt like if I took a strong position on any issue that we were facing, a policy question or how to respond to some particular development, then all the other people in the room would know that I had a bias. I favored a certain outcome. And I felt my role was to have everyone come to me with the information that they had. And I wanted them to see me as sort of an even broker, that I would hear what everyone had to say and then reflect whatever the president decided. And that turned out to be the right way to go, because very often I had, cabinet members would pull me aside and say, hey, you really have to understand this. And then 10 feet away, another cabinet person would tell me exactly the opposite. So you have to kind of, figure out, well, where does the president come out in all of this? And so I was a little bit circumspect when there were meetings of the cabinet or the senior staff. I used to sit in kind of the outer circle and just watch everybody and take it all in, so that I could then reflect how the decision making was actually done. And I think that's the quintessential role of the press secretary. And it also is useful to the media as they report on what the president is doing. Because if the media knows that you're in the room where it happens, to quote the Broadway play, that you are authoritative and you've got information that they can rely upon. Trevor, just take a little time to explain the geography of the West Wing. The press secretary's office sits right there in that West Wing that we see on television, right. Fictionalized sometimes. But it's got a back door to that office. And if you go out the back door and turn right, 50 feet away, you're in the Oval Office with the president. And if you turn left and go the other direction, 50 feet away, you're in that press briefing room that we all see on television. And I almost sort of think of that as a metaphor for the job. You're halfway between these two people in a very adversarial relationship, but your job is to make it a professional and useful one. so that we're giving information that the American people can use to make their own decisions, their own choices about what they think of what's happening in Washington.
Thank you for that metaphor. That's great. I was not aware of the literal distance and the literal proximity to both of those things, but this is a great segue into the next question. So we talked a little bit about your connection with the principle you're representing, but then you're representing them to ultimately the public, but the mediator is the press. So talk about how your role, how do you build the relationship you need to be that honest broker with the media?
Well, in my case, I'd had the benefit of having been around in Washington for a long time. So most of the members of the press corps that covered the White House knew me from some of the previous roles I'd had in the Senate or with the political party. And I think those personal relationships are very important because, you know, I knew all the reporters who were covering the president individually. Some of them I liked, some of them not so much. But they all kind of knew that I would be pretty much a straight shooter. They knew that I would spin from time to time. Part of this job is to try to put the best possible light on whatever the president is doing. And even sometimes when things don't go particularly well, you have to kind of come up with some plausible explanation of what's happened and what you're going to do to fix whatever the problem is. But I think as long as there's that element of trust, that they believe that there's some with some confidence that the person who's speaking is knowledgeable, has access to the facts, has the ear of the president, then they will trust that spokesperson, that press secretary, to reliably report on what's happening. And that's what ultimately what they want. You know, in theory, both sides want the same thing. They both want the truth to be reported, because most presidents think they're doing the right thing. And if the truth just got reported, everyone would see how grand and spectacular it is, the job that we're doing. And of course, the press wants the truth because that's their fundamental role, to hold accountable those who are in power, to challenge, to look for more facts, to question things that don't seem right. And it can be a very testy relationship sometimes, but I did everything I could to make it an amicable relationship.
So let's transition now. Thanks for all that context and background. That's really, really helpful. And let's talk about the most recent presidency outside of the one we're in now, the Biden administration. And as you watched the Trump presidency and you sort of focused on the way he and his administration communicated with the media, and thinking back, you were in that role not so long before then. What were your biggest takeaways? Just sort of, rather than push you into a corner, just like what were your big reflections on that?
Well, I see the Trump presidency when it comes to this critical relationship between the media and the Oval Office, the presidency itself. I see it as an aberration. Every president pretty much chafes at the press they have. You can go back and read letters from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and they didn't particularly like the press coverage that they got. And of course, we had times in our history when the press was very partisan and aligned with one political party or another. So we've gone through times in which the press is, plays kind of an adversarial role, a protagonist role in our system. But Trump was different. And I think it came from declaring that the press is the enemy of the people. And once you've declared that press corps is the enemy, and that you are, looking disdainfully at the role they play in our system, then it becomes very, very difficult to get done the work that needs to get done. There's just critical information that the public needs to have. The public has a right to know that information. And I believe the White House has an obligation to provide that information, but that all broke down during the Trump years. We had a whole year in which the president's press secretary did not do a single briefing for the press. And I just think that's not the way things should be done. We've restored some of the natural order during the Biden presidency now, although things are different, and things are different because the media has changed. The political environment has changed because things are so poisoned and difficult to understand sometimes. So I think we're in sort of a new age when it comes to presidential communications, and we won't go back to the way it was when I was press secretary. My daughter likes to say, "Dad, yeah, you were a big wheel at the White House, but that was the last century." And, and it's a good observation because things have changed a lot since the 1990s.
Well, one of the big things that's changed, and so I take your point that the one big difference is President Trump's declaration that the press writ large was the enemy. But another big change in this last century is the advent of social media and the ability of the person in the office to communicate directly with whoever he or she sees as their constituents. How much has that changed the role of the press secretary as this sort of intermediary between the communicator and the receiver?
Yeah, it has fundamentally altered the role of the press secretary. I've met with some of my successors, those who served for President George Bush and for Obama. And when we compare notes, I think to myself, boy, the job that they had is so different from the job I had, because I didn't have to contend with Twitter or Facebook or nonstop pronouncements or a president waking up at 3 a.m. in the morning and starting to Twitter what was ever on his mind. Now, in some ways, the press would love that because, you know, their job is to report everything the president is thinking and doing. And so to have a direct pipeline through Twitter to that is probably pretty useful, but it needs to be regarded with some skepticism. And I think, you know, you have to not take everything that a president twitters literally. But social media has profoundly changed presidential communications, and I think it's here to stay. Biden uses it very sparingly compared to Trump, but I think, you know, those around the president have a, you know, presence in social media, and that will continue to have that because it's just a necessary part of the way business gets done.
Just thinking back on what you were saying earlier about you sitting around the perimeter essentially of the cabinet and listening to the cabinet debate and discuss, and ultimately the president is the decision maker. But I can see the value of you being able to synthesize that conversation. I would imagine that sort of disappears when presidents can just, you know, idly say, here's what I think. There's no synthesis of that deeper conversation within the administration.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think it's true that Trump rarely met with his cabinet. So that kind of setting was not, you know, he made decisions sometimes impulsively, just on the spur of the moment, and not really clear what kind of process they had. But that process is part of what the role of the press secretary is. You know, one good example of that, preparing to do that daily briefing every day was an exercise in public policy making. Mm-hmm. I would get a briefing book. I would get all the answers that had been developed by the staff and by the various federal departments and agencies and put it all together in a briefing book. And then I would go to President Clinton and I would say, okay, here are the questions I'm going to face today in the briefing room, and here's the proposed answer. And sometimes he'd look at it and say, well, that doesn't say anything. And I said, I know, that's kind of where our policy is right now. And he would sometimes jump in and call a cabinet member or say, look, Mike's got to answer this question. We have to have a better answer to this question. So actually the act of preparing for this daily briefing became part of the policymaking process itself, which I think is interesting and not widely reported on sometimes.
No, that's fascinating. Just as a comparison, so you mentioned that under President Trump, there was a year in which we had no press conferences. Average week for you in the Clinton presidency, how many times would you meet with President Clinton and how many press conferences would there be?
Well, it was very important to me to every day that I was doing a briefing to have some time with the president one way or another to go over that briefing book that I described so that I could really get exactly right the way he wanted something said. And that was important. So sometimes we would just have routine meetings in the morning and I would get a chance to talk to him about how we were going to handle a particular issue. But if that didn't arise on the calendar, I had what were called walk-in rights. I could come before the briefing and just tell the president's secretary I need to see the president before I do the briefing, and I could walk in. I didn't have to schedule an appointment, and I invariably did that. And I think it was very useful because then I would get dialed by President Clinton to a certain meter. Sometimes I would say, okay, here's how I'm going to respond to Newt Gingrich, who was then the Speaker of the House of Representatives. We had sort of a sea change in politics halfway through President Clinton's first term because Republicans took control of the House. And he would very often, sometimes he would say, oh, you can't say that because I talked to Newt last night and, we're trying to work something out. And so there were other staff people there. We'd all look at each other and said, you talked to Gingrich last night? And nobody knew it. And so it was important, pretty important to have that information. So, that it goes back to the point that you're not there to represent your own thinking. You're there to represent the president's thinking. The more access you have to the president, the better you can do the job.
Interesting. Well, in a minute, I want to turn to focus on the current presidency and ultimately the future. But I do want to come back to something you said just a little bit ago, which was President Trump declared the media as the enemy. And yet he had favorites in the media, and those would change. How does that, it's sort of a layer below the just general pronouncement that this is fake news. How does courting one press outlet over another change the dynamic for someone in your role?
Well, it causes problems because favorable treatment to one reporter sometimes generates better coverage or maybe a splashy article on page one. But then you have 99 other reporters who are a little bit miffed that they didn't get equal treatment. So you have to be sparing in how you court these relationships. And good reporters are not there to be friends with the president. They are not there to have a social relationship. They're there. It's all business. And I admired the reporters who, stuck to what their job was and didn't try to kind of come cozy up to Bill Clinton and, try to be pals with him, because that's just not the role that the reporter should play. Neither should the White House staff think that they are going to have, good personal relationships. Now, I had a lot of friends in the press corps. When we were traveling overseas, we would go out to dinner sometimes, but I knew what the boundaries were, and I knew that you had to be very careful. So treating, one reporter, one news organization with a little more, favoritism over others inevitably would cause some problems. Now, sometimes we did that deliberately because we wanted to get a story on page one because it would then drive coverage from some of the other news organizations. But we were pretty careful and intentional about doing it. It kind of comes to an issue that always arises, which is about leaking. How do you leak? What circumstances do you leak information out? And generally, we did it when we were trying to advance a particular objective. We did not do it when we thought there was going to be some adverse consequence from leaking, or when it was just a leak that came about from some person who was disgruntled, who just didn't go get with the program, which happened on occasion.
So ultimately, one group we haven't really talked a lot about yet, and this will be our transition into the sort of present and future, is the public. What do you think that the Trump presidency has done for sort of faith of Americans in their elected leaders and their ability to communicate in a truthful and honest way? A headline we often hear is declining trust and faith in public institutions, inclusive of our elected officials and the press. Is that an accurate headline in your mind?
It very much is. I mean, we see that distrust for government and the institutions of government really at an all-time high now. I was looking through some data the other day, and only 20% of the American people report themselves as believing that they are getting accurate information from the government, which means that 80% of the American people are skeptical and mistrustful in some ways. And there is a very partisan divide on this. The way Democrats look at a Democratic president and Republicans look at a Republican president creates a real polarization in our political culture. And I think that's unfortunate. But if you look, just about every issue that you can imagine, immigration, COVID, health, education, everything that we are dealing with that are critical issues on our national agenda, there's a huge disparity between the way Democrats, self-described Democrats and self-described Republicans look at it. A lot of people call themselves independent, but it turns out that they tend to affiliate with one side or the other. And I think it's very, very hard to repair that breach. Obviously, President Biden came to office saying that he was going to try, but you can already see in the early stage of his presidency that we're kind of reverting to these patterns where it's almost constant political warfare. And I think that's a dangerous thing for our country.
So you mentioned Biden, and you've talked about him a little bit already. So now I want to turn the attention to sort of where we are now and where we go in the future. So Biden presidency comes in the wake of a very changed political environment, certainly than the one you operated in. What are your sort of early reactions to how the Biden administration is handling that act of communicating to the public?
Well, President Biden has stayed very focused on a pretty complicated agenda. And he obviously has done this in the midst of one of the worst public health crises the country has ever faced. And so he's had to be very sharply focused on the response to the pandemic and then, trying to advance some of the responses to that, particularly the relief bill, now the very large infrastructure package that he's trying to put together. It looks very much like that this is going to be done on partisan terms, not dissimilar from President Obama when he tried and successfully passed a major change in the nation's healthcare insurance structure. And I give President Biden good grades. I think he has performed admirably. Donald Trump never got above 50% in his favorable rating in polls, and President Biden is around 65% with an approval rating so far in his presidency. And I think that's because he seems a genuinely accessible person. His communications are direct. He is known to be fairly loquacious, and he's suppressed that. I don't know whether that's good staff work at the White House, but he sticks to a script, and he doesn't get dragged into a lot of tangential debates with the press corps or get off message, as we say in politics. So he's pretty much stuck to his guns. Now, whether he can continue that, whether he can successfully prosecute the case for this enormous relief and infrastructure package that he's trying to put through Congress, we'll see what happens. That's probably not going to play out until sometime this fall. But I think at the end of year one, when people are writing all the stories in the press about year one of the Biden presidency, I think on balance, it'll be a good report card as opposed to one that, shows the blemishes.
So you highlighted that he's got a complex set of policy priorities, and the environment is far more complex. Sort of from again, your role, thinking back in your role as press secretary, what are the tactics that press secretaries and the administration can use to keep the public focused on those key policy priorities?
Well, sometimes it involves working around the press corps that is captive at the White House. The White House press corps sits in these little cubbyhole offices all day long, dreaming up mischief and ways to make the press secretary miserable. I mean, that's the way I felt sometimes. But the response to that very often, and just about every president has done it, certainly President Clinton did, Obama did, Trump did to an extent too, is to get outside of Washington, to go out and talk to people, in Trump's case, he had big rallies. In Clinton's case, he used to go and do roundtables with local citizens, local leaders. And that drove press coverage in local media markets, which I think was important because, people, to the degree that they tune in and pay attention, they get a local newspaper, they get local television reports, and they would see more of the president in that context than in what they saw maybe in national news coverage. And I think that's important. Now, that plays against a trend in journalism and in the business of journalism where we've seen a decline in local reporting. And I think that's a troubling development. We see local newspapers disappearing, not being able to make it financially. And we lose something when we lose that coverage, not only of what's happening in Washington, but of local government, what's happening in our county board of supervisors or the city council. And so I'm a little bit despairing of the condition of journalism, and add to something that you mentioned earlier, the mistrust of information. People don't believe even factual information that they're getting from the media. And I think that's worrisome, because we need to have a literate citizenry if our democracy is going to function well.
So let's bring this towards a close by talking about that issue here at the end, to sort of the future of an informed citizenry and one that trusts the information it receives. And what you serve in a very interesting role. Tell us a little bit now about the Center for Public Theology and how we restore faith and trust in the values of democracy and the information we receive from it.
Well, I think it all goes to making our institutions of government more accessible and helping people understand. So, in your case, what the Glenn College is doing, through training people in public policy and understanding how policy is made, that's critical, because we need an educated group of scholars and teachers who are going to go out in the world and help others understand really the functioning of our democratic institutions. But I think it also means that you need to engage other institutions that are credible and reliable. So in my case, when I got out of the White House, I actually got interested in what we call public theology, which is the way in which religious faith traditions impact public policy making. And I went and got a degree at our local Methodist institution and got involved with them. And now I teach in a program that trains young seminarians who are going to go out to local churches or other types of ministries to be more equipped to engage their congregations or their audiences in dialogue, real honest dialogue about some of these critical issues. Because I think instead of turning to the loudest, angriest voices in our politics, we need to turn to people that we trust. And, sometimes clergy, people who are in the faith world, are people who are considered more reliable when it comes to, talking about the contemporary issues that are in the public square. So I'm kind of working in that arena now, hoping that may be just one way in which we can address some of this polarization and bitterness and mistrust that exists in our politics right now.
So one way I hear that is in you and your role formerly as press secretary, turning to a different institution, in this case, the ministry, to serve as that kind of intermediary between institutional life, the big institutions that are out there, and the people that interface with them. What faith, to use that term, do you have in the restoration of people's confidence in the press as an institution?
Well, I think that is a long-term project, and I think it requires lifting up and educating people about where are the reliable sources of public information. There's so much mistrust now that we need what we sometimes call news literacy. And I work with a couple of groups that are actually trying to develop curriculum for the K through 12 age bracket to teach people about where do you go to get real information. It's not just what you see splashed across the internet, but where are reliable sources of information that are factual that you can then use to inform your opinion. My old boss, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, used to say, we're all entitled to our own opinions, but not to our own facts. And I think developing an appreciation for factual, unbiased information is important. And of course, that requires of the press to move away from opinionated journalism and move more towards, here's something that you can rely upon that is just the factual information, and then you can go elsewhere or maybe elsewhere in the same newspaper to find opinions that shape your own thinking. But we need kind of to restructure the way in which the definition of what we call public information.
Well, Mike, thank you very much for sharing your both factual recollection of your time as press secretary, but also your deep thinking on these issues. And thank you for your service to our patron, Senator Glenn, and more importantly, to our democratic enterprise.
Well, and thank you for all the work that you're doing at OSU too. I mean, I think this is a critical area, and the more people that we can educate and more people we can get interested in public service and serving in the kind of role that I had, I think we'll be better off for it. So go for it.
Thanks, Mike.